أهلا فيكم. Welcome and good evening. I will try to speak in Arabic and language shortly. Just the initiative of this exhibition in an art studio came after I have participated in a workshop. It's called it's called MEPI, in collaboration with Arab Image Foundation and the Metropolitan Museum and Downey University, Delaware University. It was about preserving archives, photographic heritage, and from during this workshop I have met Mr. Joseph Malikian, who was a guest visitor to this workshop, and since we had this idea to collaborate together and to make a kind of with his a project about history of photography in the Middle East, because Mr. Malikian has a huge collection of Armenian photographers from the region, from the first generation until late 1950s. So we end up doing this exhibition in collaboration where we are presenting a part of his collection of few photographers, and we also collaborated with the Arab Image Foundation, who is also today represented by Rima, who is here from Beirut. Where downstairs we are showing images of Amman from 1920 to late 1960s. Okay, راح أحكي هلا بالعربي shall I continue?
لا بالعربي.
فكرة المعرض اجت من خلال مشاركتي بدورة ميبي اللي صارت بأول السنة هاي مع المؤسسة العربية للصورة ومتحف متروبوليتان جامعة دلاوري. ورشة العمل كانت كيف نتعامل مع الصور القديمة ونحافظ عليها. خلال الدورة أنا التقيت مع السيد جوزيف ماليكيان، وحبينا نعمل هذا المشروع هو معرض ومنورجي خلاله صور الكوليكشن المجموعة اللي عنده إياها على المصورين الأرمن من بدايات 1880, right? When did it start? 1855. Okay. من 1850 لحديد 1960. هون بهالطابق الأول عمارة صور من المجموعة لعدة مصورين. وفي الطابق يلي الطابق الأرضي تحت هي مجموعة المؤسسة العربية للصورة، صور عن عمان من فترة 1920 ل 1960. من ضمن شو اسمه هاي المشاركة حبينا نستضيف دكتور هشام الخطيب كمان، مشان لأنه الأستاذ هشام كمان عنده مجموعة كتير كبيرة عن فوتوغرافية طبعا وخرائط ورسومات عن فلسطين والأردن بالتحديد، وفي صور فوتوغرافية كمان من أوروبا مثل ما حكيت حضرتك. وبهالمحاضرة أستاذ جوزيف راح يحكي عن دور الأرمن، الجيل الأول من الأرمن اللي إجوا على المنطقة بعد المجزرة على الشرق الأوسط ودورهم بالتصوير. ودكتور هشام كمان بده يحكينا عن ما بعد هالفترة دور المصورين خصوصا تحديدا بفلسطين والأردن. So in this talk, it will Mr. Malikian will talk about the role of the first generation of Armenian photographers who came after the genocide into the region, and Dr. Hisham Khatib will speak about the role of the photographers after the first generation, specifically in Palestine and in Jordan. So we would like to welcome Mr. Malikian.
First of all, I'd like to thank Sua for hosting this event. Does this work?
No.
First of all, I want to thank Sua for hosting this event in this sort of magnificent building. It's got a special meaning for me to have it housed here or to have an exhibition in this building since I was born in Beirut. So it's got a special meaning and significance that I'm doing in this building. I'm very excited about this exhibit because it is the launching of this new archive that we're starting. It's called the Middle East and Armenian Photograph Archive. So it's, is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is very exciting for me because it is the launching of this new archive in the Middle East. I've done a presentation in New York previously, but this is the first one in the Middle East, and our goal and objective is to bring this archive to the region and to have it housed somewhere within an institution to make these images available. I really want to thank Eileen and Hrair. We met in January, and we all came together because of our shared interest in Armenian photography. We were across the Atlantic, and we were able to come together thanks to modern technology. So we pulled it together, and thank you to both of you. You know, people have asked me along the way what made me interested in archival photography. I am by profession a clinical psychologist. And some people have wondered, you know, what is it that inspired you along the way? And I was born in Beirut, as I mentioned earlier, and then immigrated to the United States. With the immigration came a lot of these great family photographs, which were taken overseas in Palestine, mostly in Palestine, in Aleppo. So as a child, I would often look at these images and they were intriguing. I learned a lot from them, and it always appeared that there was a story that needed to be told. As a child, I don't think I articulated it that way, but clearly there was something about these photographs, looking at them growing up. This first photograph is probably the oldest one in the family. It was taken around 1915. It belonged to a great aunt whose husband had died as a result of the genocide. This is her family, her first husband's family. So this is pretty much the only photograph we have in the family that was taken out of Turkey, Urfa. You know, clearly when the genocide started and people were told to evacuate, you know, you didn't really have time to gather your belongings or to select photographs to bring with you. However, what I understand is that my great-grandmother, as she was preparing to leave this immediate evacuation, she made a point of bringing with her a needle and thread. God forbid what would happen on this journey, that something may need to be mended. So, you know, photographs were not brought out as easily. However, 10 years after the genocide, the family settled in Jerusalem, and this is the occasion of my grandparents' wedding. Looking at this image as a child, it always seemed like it was somber, kind of haunting. I never felt like it was a celebration of one's wedding. But I come to learn many years later as an adult that every single person in this image was a survivor of the genocide. And just the stories are simply horrific. Going from being sold by a Jewish merchant to slave labor in Aleppo, watching one's father being executed by hanging in the town square, infanticide, a great aunt killing her 2 babies and then attempting suicide. So there were stories upon stories about tragic events. So clearly, you know, these photographs sparked an interest. You know, the years would pass, there would be weddings, there would be families that came together at different events. often, as we see in early photographs, a lot of people went into these studios and they would dress up in Palestinian garb and dresses, and so they would be photographed. And this had special meaning, I think, for the family because for 3-4 years the family lived in the Bedouin tribe in order to avoid being killed by the Ottomans. This is education became very important for this first generation. This is from my father's family. Actually, my father is somewhere down there on the left. There were many images in the family collection of these baptisms which were held outside of the church in Jerusalem, St. James. And I was always inspired by them. I mean, if you look at them, you see the one side, the new generation, and the old generation in black who were probably the survivors. So clearly, I mean, these were inspirational. I found that intriguing. Several years ago, a very good family friend said that she wanted to donate an image to the archive, and I really didn't know what to expect. So when she came out and she showed me the image, I was totally blown away because it was yet another baptism picture, which was taken again outside the doors of the church in Jerusalem. It was the proposed baptism in 1922. What is truly fascinating for me is when I studied this image, I was able to locate 4 family members from my mother's side. And again, I was able to place them, at least 1922, they were in Jerusalem. So, looking at all these images were truly inspirational, and I think the adage, pictures worth 1,000 words, is truly relevant, trite, but true, I think. So this was clearly an inspiration as to why I became inspired by archival photography. Several years ago, I decided to research the family history, and that's when I discovered all these horrific events that occurred, traumatic events. Clearly, the focus for the family was to get beyond these traumas. I don't think any one of them, or in the therapist's office trying to process their early traumas, survival was the theme. So I did research on the family history, and ultimately I wanted to do a book on the Armenians and the Ottoman Empire. And I wanted to do a photo essay as well as an anthology, piecing together the early photographs with the narratives from the travelers, the missionaries, and dignitaries who were in the Ottoman Empire. So I brought the two together and I created a book on the Armenians and the Ottoman Empire. In doing the research, I spent some time at the Getty Institute in Los Angeles, which is a phenomenal place. And at the Getty, they have an extensive Ottoman collection of 6,000 photographs. And although it was new to me, it was truly a revelation that many of the photographers during this period were Armenian. So clearly this was, for me, sort of an inspiration again. So my presentation today is based on the premise that Armenians played a dominant role in the early history of Near East photography. In essence, they were, from the photographers that I studied, they were the pioneers or the principal actors in the newly invented photographic industry. Before I say a little more about the Armenian photographers, I think it's important to share a little bit of history to give it some context. Photography was introduced into the Near East about 1839. It was invented between 1835 and 1839. The first photographic studio was in Constantinople, and it was opened by James Robertson, a British guy, and this was in 1855. After 1855, we see a succession of Armenian studios that developed. So we can clearly say that the Armenians played a dominant role, and they were considered to be the pioneers in the history of photography. And the question is, why? And to answer this question, I think it's important to understand the conditions that existed in the Ottoman Empire at the time. The Armenians were a minority, and they were the second largest minority in the Ottoman Empire, second to the Greeks and followed by the Jews. because of their minority status, Armenians in Constantinople were involved in commercial and industrial activity, so that this newly discovered invention, profession, craft, the photography, would fall into the hands of the minority citizens who were generally employed in commerce, trade industry, skilled trades, and artisans. In contrast, the non-minority citizens were generally involved in government and the military positions. It is also important to note that Armenians were very keen to adopt more Western European thinking and practices. And in part, this was the influence of the missionaries that came to the Ottoman Empire during this period in the 1850s, 1870s. So they had a great influence on the Armenians. And they enlightened them about literature, about philosophy, and new inventions in the Western world and Europe. So what we see is that a lot of Armenians were beginning to go to Europe and America to learn these new trades, to be educated in the institutions there. And they came back and they brought with them all these new inventions and skills. Again, photography was one of them. Another important point to make is that within the Ottoman Empire, which was largely an Islamic state, conservative and religious circles within the Islamic community rejected pictorial representations. According to Muslim religion and practice, it was forbidden to recreate the human image. So as such, the profession would be limited to the...
Truly, I mentioned something. It was not the rejection of the representation of the human. It was in the Islamic tradition the rejection of the representation of God.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so everybody thinks that pictorial representation in Islam is forbidden. Actually, no.
Right, that's what's documented in the literature. I mean,
Excuse me?
that's what's documented in the literature. Maybe that should be.
Yeah, which is I mean to say.
No, thank you, thank you.
Cliche stereotype that's always repeated and which is not true.
Right. You know, it's interesting that.
دكتور هشام انه التفكير انه الاسلام بمنع التصوير. الاسلام التصوير الله، تصوير الانبياء، تصوير. بس اما نطلع على في العصر الاموي قصير عمره، شوف المرنمات في تركيا، وشوف الحرم الشريف موجود في تصوير. بس الفكره اللي مشاعه في الغرب انه ممنوع في الاسلام التصوير. لا، تصوير وجه الله، تصوير سيدنا محمد، تصوير عرفتي مظبوط الحكي ولا لا؟ Okay, I'm sorry to have interrupted.
No, thank you for clarifying that. Again, this is what's documented in the
everywhere.
You have a point.
It's
Islam has no problem with the photography stuff.
Right.
Yeah, she's just fixing.
That's great. I'm not committed to any view. Right, and that's what you read over and over again in the literature. And having said that, it was interesting because the imperial court, the sultans, embraced photography. And what's interesting is that there was a fascination with the photography. And part it had to do with the fact that the Ottoman Empire was not in very good standing during this period of time. So the sultans had these photographers produce images of the Ottoman Empire, of the palaces, of the gardens, the military, the firefighter brigades. So they would send these photographs to Europe and to France and to show the world that they were not a backwards country. So again, the imperial court, the sultans embraced photography. Another very important point is that around this period there was this whole fascination with Orientalism, things that were exotic for the Europeans and the Americans. There was an intrigue with the images in the Ottoman Empire and in the Middle East. So with Orientalism, there was this influx of tourists. So the two coming together was an interesting blend, because what happened was, it was around this period that photography was taking a larger presence as well. So you have Orientalism, you have the influx of tourists, and then you have photographers taking images which were sold to the tourists. So there was a growing commercial aspect to photography. So what's interesting is that, again, we see images of the tourists. This is probably the most heavily photographed image of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Foreign visitors would often go to the site and have their photograph taken. And this is Queen Olga of Greece, who also made an appearance at some point during this period. So again, we have this large tourist base, and the photographers were capitalizing on it. What's interesting is that around after 1856, or after the end of the Crimean War, many Europeans came to Constantinople. By 1886, there were about 100,000 Europeans who resided in this area, predominantly in the area of Pera, which became the European center of Constantinople. And here we see the Grand Rue de Pera, which was the Fifth Avenue of Pera at the time. And on the street, one would find all the boutiques that housed all the European fashions, and as well as many of the photographers that were beginning to emerge at their studios in Pera as well. So again, what we see is the growing presence of these photographers, and if you study this street, you'll identify many Armenian photographers. And what I'd like to do at this point is to speak about a couple of the very well-known photographers. I have a lot of images that I want to show, but I'm not going to dwell on any one image. I mean, that can be done by anyone who wants to study the images later on. But I want to give an overview of what these studios created. Abdullah Hrair, they consisted of three brothers, Viken, Kevork, Viken being the oldest, Kevork, and then the youngest, the middle brother, Hofsep. What's interesting is that Viken was working as a finisher, touching up photographs, in the studio of a German chemist. This was in 1856. His brother Kevork returned from the Rafaelian Armenian Academy in Venice after 6 years studying art and other subjects, philosophy. So he became a very knowledgeable, learned man. So when Kevork returned from Venice, the three brothers established the photo studio Abdullah Hrair, and they bought out the German photographer Rabach. So here we see some samples of the work that was done. And during this period, there were a lot of cartes de visite. I don't know if some of you are familiar with them. They're very small images that, for the most part, they consisted of portraits. And these are the cartes de visite from the Abdullah Hrair. Here we see the back of the cards, the carte de visite, as well as the cabinet cards. This is invaluable information if you study the back of these cards. Not only is it more valuable when someone writes on them, because we get a date out of it, or we can identify the subject in the photo, but if you study the different logos over the many different decades, you see transitions, you see patterns, you see affiliation with various societies. So we learn a lot from the back of these photographs. Again, these are some of the many samples that came out of the Abdullah Hrair studio. And what we do know is that in 1863, the Sultan declared the Abdullah Hrair as the official court photographers, and they were often labeled as the outstanding artists of the city. Under the Ottoman Sultans for decades, they were commissioned to document aspects of the Ottoman Empire. Again, the military life in the lavish imperial court, exotic customs and traditions. And again, this was in an effort to showcase to the world that they were a civilized people. So again, we see many images that came out of this photo studio. Again, they would become very famous over time. They would gain recognition in Paris. They became part of the society, the French Society of Photography. And so what I'd like to show you quickly are some of the examples that came out of their studio. These are the cabinet cards in various poses. Officials who came to the studio to be photographed, children. The photograph on the right, on the left, is interesting because it was signed by Abdullah Hrair. This was very rare, which makes this photo extremely valuable to have the signature on the photograph. They were also photographed all different citizens. These were the eunuchs who worked in the palace for the Sultan. They also stepped out of the studio, again, the name of the exhibit, in and out of the studio. Again, their work documented life in the city of Constantinople. This was the Sultan's palace, as well as his mosque. And here's an image of his mosque. This is the Sultan going to prayers on Friday evening. And again, these were images that were made for the tourist market, natives, monuments, mosques. Again, we see different images. These are documented photos of different subjects dressed in costumes, smoking the nargila, men in prayer. We see the hamals on the street, the water cellars. Again, we see a lot of images of the mosques in and out of the city. These were all taken by Abdullah Hrair again. This is the palace, the interior of a mausoleum. Cemeteries around the city. Here we see the main bridge in Constantinople, the architecture of the homes. In 1886, what we see happening is that here from 1858, they enjoyed tremendous success, the Abdullah Hrair, but things started to change because they had competition. And what happened was that in 1868, they had been invited by the Prince of Wales to start a studio in London, but with the personal assistance of the Prince. But the brothers turned this down. But in 1887, 86, because things were beginning to change, there was a lot of competition, they decided to take the offer that was offered by the Khedive in Egypt to help them open a branch in Cairo. So again, what we see, again, the Orientalist themes were emerging in those images that came out of Egypt. The monuments, again, we see people in the open spaces in the markets, people congregating on the streets, people in the suburbs, in the marketplace, and also the cart drivers, yes. So what we see is that in 1880, as I mentioned, 86, they go to Egypt. They start to wind down in Egypt, the two brothers, Kevork and Hafsat. It's not clear where Vikan went at this point, but they ended up in Cairo, and eventually they closed the business. They sold their business to, in 1899, they sold it to Seba Joyer. Pascal Seba was another famous photographer. Seba was half Armenian, and his mother was Armenian, and his father was a Syrian Catholic. Like Abdullah Hrair, Seba enjoyed tremendous success as well. As noted previously, with the spread and fascination with Orientalism by Westerners during the mid-1800s, photography was becoming a means to present the Orient in a more realistic way than paintings. And clearly, Seba benefited from this historical development. So again, we see, as I showed you before, we see the back of the carte de visite and cabinet. And again, we gather a lot of information looking at these logos. Again, what we see is that the first studio that Seba opened was in 1857, and it was called El Shark. So again, we see many images that came out of the studio, the carte de visite. And again, there was a fascination with women who were wearing the ashmak, the veils. This was a common image that was heavily photographed, again, for the Western market. Here we see a lot of different Westerners, I guess, who came into the studio. There were a lot of students who were studying in Roberts University, which was an American institution, who would come and have their photos taken. We see here many different people, Circassians, peasants who came to the studio. We see foreign military people. Again, this is a form of a cabinet card, a much larger image of I would imagine a Westerner in his costume that came to visit. Again, heavily photographed were these images of women wearing the veils. Interestingly, the image on the right is from 1873. Seba got a really big break. He was commissioned by Osman Hamdi Bey, a Turkish painter, to make a series of costume studies of people from different regions and social classes of the Ottoman Empire. The album was called Les Costumes Populaires de la Turquie, and it was shown at the Vienna International Exhibition and won the gold medal by the Viennese organizers. And then when Seba returned, he got tremendous recognition by Sultan Abdulaziz. So just to show you some images that came out of the Seba studio were these. These are the cabinet photos. I guess animals were brought into the studio as well. Images of families. Here again, many students that came into the studio. And also, like Abdullah Hrair, Seba went into the community to take images of life and times in the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople. What we see happening again, as with Abdullah Hrair in 1873, which was really a big year because he had gotten all these awards and recognition. He went to Cairo. He decided to open a studio in Cairo. Again, there were many tourists going there, so why not capture those exotic Orientalist images and sell them to the tourists who were eventually making their way to Egypt. So again, we see many of the images of the women, the veiled women, the sheikhs, the water sellers, the drivers, and we see carefully composed, beautiful compositions, according to many people, that Seba really mastered the art of how he placed his subjects. Again, we can see this was a very common image that was taken by many photographers climbing the pyramids. This was a wedding. Again, carefully organized images of life and times in Egypt. The different people on the streets that were brought into the studio. Again, people on horses, on donkeys, on camels, and panoramic views of Cairo. Seba also captured. Again, of course, the monuments were a hit, and they were clearly sold frequently to the tourists. These are all images that were purchased by the tourists. The fountains, the architecture, and here we see carefully organized image again of a family eating, I guess. Again, people sitting on the streets, farmers, men in the deserts on their camels. Again, this was totally intriguing for the Western market tourists. And this is an image that was also captured by many other photographers, the road leading to the monuments. When Seba died in 1886, his son was only 14 years old. So his brother Cosmi Seba took over the studio for just a couple of years until his son was able to take over at age 16. And so Cosmi, again, in the same way as Seba, his brother, took images of Egypt. I don't think it was the same quality as Pascal's work, but nevertheless, this is what he created. Again, the Nile would be a very popular image. Again, we see many of the mosques that were photographed, the military. So that was Cosmi's work. J.P. Seba was the son of Pascal Seba. And I'm going to show you some images, and there's a bit of controversy about these images because the signature on all of them were J.P. Seba. It appears that perhaps these were really the father's work, Pascal, because it's not clear that Jean, who was the son, was in Egypt, and perhaps what he did was just put a J in front of his father's name. But in his own right, Jean would become a very well-known photographer later on. I'll share a little more with you. So these were the images that JP signed, and I think they were truly his father's work. Again, it was the same genre as the father, the attractive models, the careful lighting and great attention to detail that we often saw in Pascal's work. And again, these were images of people obviously brought into the studio by Pascal or JP. Again, similar images of the water cellars. And this was unusual because during this period you didn't really see color in the photographs, and there was slight tinting which was done, and maybe we can give JP credit for this. Again, in this collection, we see a lot of, this was an image that was captured by perhaps all the photographers during this time period of the Egyptian dancers and the musicians. This was a beautiful image taken by J.P. Sebah, Pascal, but we see this image that was also taken by the other photographers. Felix Bonfils was also a very well-known photographer at the time, and he also took images of people throughout the Middle East. His studio was based in Beirut, and he traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, and he also captured images such as these. Again, this is a beautiful image, well preserved, of the dancer with the singers. And interestingly, in the 1890s, we see the same image, which was tinted. It was a whole new processing that was developed in Germany. And this previous image of Bonfils was converted and tinted. So we see the same image again by Laqajian, whose work is represented here in this exhibit. This was a very popular theme. This was it's an amazing image because if you study it, and it's in this room here, what you'll notice is that you can see the photographer in the mirror behind the dancers and the musicians. Again, JP went into the community and he photographed different ethnic groups, architecture of the different minarets and the mosques, the domes of the mosques. Different mosques as well. Again, we see the same images. Again, this is for the tourist market. So the fountains, monuments. On your right, you'll see a photo of the Shepherd's Hotel. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Shepherd's Hotel. It was a very famous hotel that was frequented by the upper class tourists. And it was, I believe, destroyed during the 1950s during the Egyptian uprising. But it was an image, it was a hotel that was heavily photographed by many different photographers. And again, here we see the same image of the hotel, the front of the hotel. So again, we see many images of the Nile, the Aswan, that were taken by J.P. Sebah, Pascal. So many of the similar images, people in the streets. Again, I think this was probably staged for the photographer. We see the images of the people in their shop.
If you kindly go to the previous, this is, I've got in my collection an original painting, color painting of this
Is that right?
photograph. So they use the painters, it's by a Hungarian painter. Painters used to have these photographs and make paintings on them.
Why not? I mean, they were beautiful images.
This one, I've got a painting of this photograph.
Yeah, and this was why Pascal Sebah was so famous. I mean, he carefully organized his images. I think a lot of time went into the images, and we often forget who is behind the lens. Because the photographer imposes a great deal of influence on what he's creating in the image. Again, we have the shopkeepers, which were intriguing for the tourists. The bazaars. We see the sugarcane workers in an alleyway. The pottery makers with the kilns. Education was often photographed. So now's the time to give credit to J.P. Sebah, Jean Sebah. in 1888, at 16, formed a partnership with Polycarp Joliet. And what's interesting is that they were together for a period of about 10 to 12 years until Joliet went back to Paris. And it was around this time, during this period, 1900, that Seba and Joliet took over the Abdullah Hrair studio, and they named themselves as the successors of Abdullah Hrair. They were capitalized on their name. Again, as I mentioned, Joliet left for Paris, and John Seba formed a partnership with Hagop Eskender, who was an Armenian, and Leo Perpignani, an Italian, and Perpignani left around 1914. So for a period of time, we have Seba and Joliet, and let me show you some of the images from this studio. Again, very similar images to what his father was producing. Images of the people, the dancers, the women from the harem with the nargilas and the dancers. Again, frequently photographed with these images of women in the yashmaks. Again, Seba and Joliet did extensive photographing of the city of Constantinople, the different mosques. And by this period, I think the photographs have probably improved because we see an improvement in technology and an improvement in processing photographs. We see the interior of the mosques. This was Roberts College on the Bosphorus. Again, more images of the mosques and the interior of the mosques. We see images of people on the streets. Again, back in the studio, Seba and Joliet would create carte de visites. It's very similar, like Abdullah Hrair and Pascal Seba. And again, this is my fascination, and that is the study of the back of these cards. Again, we get dates out of them. We get, cards that didn't have much on them, but then over time you see affiliations and awards that were, given to the photographers. Again, we have many of these images, the carte de visite. Again, the cabinet cards were quite popular until about 1900s. Again, we see tourists who came into were European residents in Para who came to get their photos taken, portraits, many more portraits. We see children who were photographed, and it's interesting, it's the same two children, slight changes in the image. Again, more children. And again, these were probably meant for the tourist market to show men in their traditional costumes, smoking nargila. These were women from the harem. Again, another intrigue for the tourist market. Here we have larger cabinet cards, again, of different tourists that came to the studios. By 1900s and a little later, now we see a change in the format of the images. The mounting seems to change, the images are larger, the portraits obviously are clearer because we have better processing. Again, we have images with different mountings. And again, eventually on your right, you'll see a postcard. And this was probably the trend at some point in time. We're going from carte de visite to cabinet cards to postcards. And again, Seba and Joliet went out into the community and they photographed schools. This is a Greek school during gym class. Again, schools were often photographed. As I mentioned earlier, Seba formed a partnership with Iskender, Hagop Iskender, for about 20 plus years. And then eventually Hagop left and his son Bedros took over the practice. As you could see, the Seba studio went from 1857, and as I will show in a minute, it lasted until 1952. So it was in practice for about 95 years with different people taking over. Then again, Seba and Iskender again went into the community, and eventually Bedros Iskender would leave and would sell the practice to Ismail Insel, a Turkish man, and he would call the studio Foto Sabah, which Sabah meaning morning in Turkish, and the studio eventually closed in 1952, and this is an image from Photo Sabah, clearly, and it was probably taken in the 1940s. There were other photographers as well. I'm going to quickly go over them. Again, they capitalized on the Orientalist movement. Again, we see more images, and again, that's why perhaps the Abdullah Frères went out of business over time, because there was a lot of competition. Miran Iranian was also photographing life and times in Constantinople. Again, we see more of the same images. Probably the images were better because the photography, the technology had changed somewhat. Again, we see Iranian taking an image of the Sultan going to prayers on a Friday evening, as did Abdullah Frère. There were other studios as well. Gomez Frère. It was made up of three brothers, three Armenian brothers, Arten, Yervant, and Grigor. And they also practiced both portrait photography, documented life, and historic sites in and around Constantinople. They sold the studio in 1900 to Asil Semensi, who developed the Apollon studio, which became a very famous studio in Constantinople. Again, Gomez Frère capitalized on the same theme. Different angles, different viewpoints. But also they spent some time in the studio, we're back in the studio, and they created images of people. Perhaps this is a brother and a sister. So we had Gomez Frère. And then we also had Atelier Phoebus, which was also called Photographie Phoebus. And this was run by Bohos Tarkurian. He opened the studio in 1882 and eventually closed it in 1936. What makes him fascinating is that he worked during the Ottoman period, and then in 1915, when the genocide occurred, we see many photographers like left Constantinople, but interestingly, Tarkurian stayed on, and he worked for the Turkish Republic in the Turkish Republic period, and he became the photographer for Ataturk. So it's interesting that he would go from this one period of time when we see sort of many Armenians dropping out, and then he stays on and creates images. And he became very well known in, I think, 1893, 1890, he created a nice, interesting relationship with the Sultan, and the Sultan used many of his photographs for albums that the Sultan created to send to the United States. So here we have Phoebus, again, many images coming out of the studio, again catering to the upper class, carefully constructed images, families. Again, we see several other Armenian photographers, Darat Baldasarian, who created photography on Malikian. He also was in this early period. What's interesting about Baldasarian is that we see him in Constantinople, and then we next see him in Bulgaria, in Plovdiv. And we're going to assume that perhaps the uprisings in 1894-95, the Median massacres, led him to leave Bulgaria. Again, we see images that came out of Bulgaria by Baldasarian. Again, Papazian has the same story. We see him in Constantinople, creating images by Mateos and then the brothers together in Constantinople. And then, again, we see them again in Bulgaria. Again, I think they also fled because of the uprising, the political situation in Constantinople. And they would create a studio in Varna, Bulgaria. Some similar themes, studio portraits. This is another early photographer, Antoine Zapoccian, very early, probably 1860s. Again, we see all these different photographers who created studios in Hera. Hissarlian was another one, Katazian, who also had a studio in Paris. Karashian, Karash Frère, again, Armenian brothers who had studios in Constantinople. And we see Amirian, also a studio. We see Donatosian, who also had a studio in Iraq as well as Constantinople. Now, going out of Constantinople, we see a number of photographers in the different towns and villages in Andronople see Adana, Malikian, we see Srkisian, we see a number of these photographers in the towns and villages throughout the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, some of them came back to Constantinople, the Armenians, after 1920, and they created their own studios again. We see others who went outside of the studio to take photographs, like Kapayan. So basically, this is the history of Armenian photography in Constantinople. And I want to leave you with this quote, which was by an Armenian photographer right here in Amman in 1980. It was an interview by Dickinson Jenkins Miller. We did a thesis on Armenian photographers in Lebanon. And the quote is really telling of the history of the Armenians and their history with Armenian photography. And it says, in my grandfather's day, when it all began, many of us were able to acquire technical training in Turkey. We were Christians and had no worries about making pictures above all. In the time of persecutions, we had to be able swiftly to begin life again, naked in a new place. Skills cannot be robbed, and we could always get new lenses and paper wherever we fled. And so this is the story of the Armenian photographers who started in Constantinople, and we see a number of them flourishing in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Palestine. So this is my presentation.
Thank you, Joe, very much for sharing these beautiful images and also the history. And now we would like to invite Dr. Hisham.
التصوير الفوتوغرافي اخترع سنة 1939 بعد
3 شهور من اختراعه كان المصورين الفرنسيين الذين اخترعوه يصوروا في القدس. فهناك صور بانورامية للقدس من 1839. I'm saying that since photography was invented in 1839, 38, 39, within 3 months, French photographers were working in Jerusalem. And there are prints of these photographs. فلذلك القدس وفلسطين سبحان مكان من أكثر الأماكن التي صورت. أنا الآن أعرض بعض الصور بسرعة يعني وبداية ترتيب بس لعرض الأمور بصفة عامة. فأول صورة نبدأ فيها هي جيروزاليم 1890 للأمريكان كولوني، وأنا حفظتها في البداية لأنه حاليا في الأمريكان كولوني في القدس يوجد هناك معرض لتاريخهم الفوتوغرافي. There is now an exhibition in the American colony in Jerusalem of their photographic collection. الأمريكان كولوني مؤسسة عربية، يعني هذا بيت الحسيني بنى الحسيني كان رئيس بلدية القدس وبنى هذا البيت في أواخر القرن التاسع عشر، وبعد ذلك أجروا وامتلكوا الأمريكان كولوني اللي هم مسيحيين جاءوا من أمريكا أصلهم سويدي وعنده مركز فوتوغرافي في هذا المكان. والأمريكان كولوني الآن هو أكبر فندق أو أهم فندق في كل القدس، لكن الجزء الفوتوغرافي منه أعتقد تسكر 1930. لكن كثير من الفوتوغرافز الموجودة للقدس هي من عمل الأمريكان. هذا منظر آخر بانوراما للقدس، لأن القدس اشتهرت بالبانوراميك فيوز أوف جيروزاليم. هذا one of the panoramic views of Jerusalem. وميزة القدس عن بقية دول العالم إنه إذا وقفت على جبل الزيتون كنت تقدر إنك تعمل فوتوغرافيك فيو لكل المدينة في صورة واحدة. ولذلك يعني فوتوغرافيك panoramic views of Jerusalem could all be captured in one single photograph from Mount Olives. This is one of them of F.M. Good. He is a very well-known photographer, and he was assistant to Fritz who came to Jerusalem in 1957 and started photographing there in 1957. Good was one of his assistants, and this is 1860. هذا منظر آخر لزنجاكي. زنجاكي كان له فوتوغراف استوديو في القاهرة وكان يصور في فلسطين، وهذه الإيستر احتفال الإيستر في كنيسة القيام في القدس سنة 1990. هنا صورة للباديكرز. الباديكر هو دليل السياح وهو أهم دليل السياح في العالم. الباديكر هو دليل السياح ألماني وتوقف إصداره فقط في 20-30 سنة، لكن الباديكرز هي أهم أدلة السياحة في العالم. وفي الباديكر تبع فلسطين، وهذا باديكر عن القدس في سنة 1876 وكان يعرض بالطبع صور القدس منذ ذلك الوقت. هذا الحقيقة منظر دمسكس جيت، باب الخليل، باب العمود في القدس، وهذه مدرسة شميت وهي من أشهر مدارس القدس. بنوها الألمان لما جاء الإمبراطور الألماني أعطته الحكومة العثمانية أرض وبنى فيها مدرسة شميت، وكانت أول شيء نوع من مقر الحكومة البريطانية كانت هنا، وثم عمل مستشفى والآن فيها مدرسة كبيرة مدرسة شميت. حقيقة هذا بوستكارد أنا حطيته لأنه حتى أروي كيف كان يبعث البوستكارد وعليها الطابع، ففي نجد على طرف البوستكارد طابع كان يبعث السياح هذه الصور وعليها البوستكارد، وهذا بوستكارد في سنة 1905. هذه خليل رعد. خليل رعد الحقيقة هو أشهر مصور فلسطيني. هو تلميذ كركبيان الأرمينيان فوتوغرافر. الحقيقة كان رئيس أول المصورين في القدس من أهل القدس، كان الارتش بيشوب الأرميني، وأيضا مصور آخر اسمه دانيس. الاثنين بدوا يعملوا في القدس سنة 1855. I'm saying the first local photographers in Jerusalem, local. There were earlier photographers, but the locals were the Armenian Archbishop of Jerusalem. I think I've forgotten his name. Caribbean. And he had two sons, Karkarian, Gregorian. I'm sorry, I'm very bad at names, but what's important is the history perspective. So the Archbishop, Armenian Archbishop, and Dennis, the local Jerusalem photographer, were the first two local photographers in Jerusalem. They started work in 1855. But the Armenian Archbishop was a big photographer, and he photographed Jerusalem extensively, and he had two sons. And these two sons were the most important photographers in Jerusalem later on. If you can recall the name, please, Karkarian? Gregorian. And Gregorian was the teacher of Hrair, Hrair was the teacher, student of Karkarian. And I think Hrair married the sister of Karkarian or something like that. There were, yes, or vice versa. So there was an intermarriage, and Hrair became the most important Palestinian photographer. He's originally Syrian from Lebanon, but he was residing in Jordan since 1890. And he remained there until 1948. وقت النكبة يعني. تم مستمر بالعمل في الاستوديو تبعه 58 سنة. ومجموعته هي أكبر مجموعة عن تاريخ فلسطين وصور فلسطين إطلاقا. وهي موجودة الآن في مركز الدراسات الفرنسية في بيروت. وهل يعني مش مؤكد هل لا تزال موجودة ولا لا؟ لأنه لما صار الغزو الإسرائيلي للبنان ما نعرف شو صار في المجموعة.
لا موجودة
موجودة لا تزال. ممتاز إذا لم يعني تسلط في الغزو الذي صار في تلك الفترة. فمجموعة هذه هي أكبر مجموعة عن تاريخ فلسطين. الحقيقة هذه ما نسميه staged photograph، يعني كانوا مصورين يجيبوا الناس ويصوروهم. ما هي الصورة طبيعية، ما هيش عائلة طبيعية، كانوا يجمعوا الناس ويصوروهم وتطلع الصور اللي هي staged photographs. هذه الحقيقة صورة ثانية لمصور مقدسي اسمه من الهيثمية، اسمه علي زعرور. وعلي زعرور مهم جدا في تاريخ التصوير الفلسطيني، لأنه هو اللي صور حرب 1948. هو كان المصور الرسمي للجيش العربي في الحرب 48، وصور كل المعارك والحقيقة انتصارات الجيش العربي في فلسطين سنة 48. فمجموعته لعلي زعرور من أهم المجموعات إطلاقا عن التصوير الفوتوغرافي في فلسطين. وأنا بقول في منتهى الأسف يعني اللي اكتشف قيمته ووثقوا هم الإسرائيليين للأسف. يعني أنا عرفت عنه عن تاريخه وتوثيقه وكل شيء من الكتابات الإسرائيلية، فهذا يدل على مدى إهمالنا للتاريخ. هذه برضو صورة للأمريكان كولوني. زي ما قلت الأمريكان كولوني كانت من أكثر المؤسسات اللي وثقت تاريخ فلسطين بين الفترة 1890 لحوالي 1930، ونشرت ألوف الصور. والحقيقة فيها ألبومات. الألبومات هذه كانت توضع داخل خشب من ألفود. فالحقيقة الألبومات ثمينة جدا، وأنا شخصيا أهتم جدا باقتناء هذه الألبومات المغلفة بخشب الزيتون تبع القدس. فبقول the most important thing in Jerusalem was photographic albums covered by Olfwood plates, and these are some of the most important heritage of Jerusalem. وكانت تباع من محل اسمه مروم في باب شارع يافا، هو مش شارع في داخل باب الخليل. وكان محل مروم وميو، اثنين كان مروم وميو مفتوحين حتى نهاية القرن الماضي، يعني قبل 20 سنة وقت هذا للقدس وأكثر من عندهم الصور. للأسف يعني فيها الوضع السيء اللي صار في القدس سكروا هذول المحلين، وهل فهمتوا انه هاجروا برضه على استراليا. هذه الحرم الشريف لفرانسيس بيدفورد. الحقيقه الصورة أحسن من هيك والطبعة مش كما يجب. فرانسيس بيرفورد جاء إلى فلسطين في 1862 مع البرنس أوف ويلز. He was the photographer of Prince of Wales, and his mother, the Queen, sent the Prince of Wales in a tour to the Holy Land to acquaint himself about civilization before he became king. So this photographer was Francis Bedford, and Francis Bedford made some of the most fantastic photographs of Palestine and also but I'm very much interested in Palestinian photographs, and there are 3 books which contains his photographs. يوجد 3 كتب، 2 منهم عندي في المجموعة والثالث مش عندي في المجموعة، بس هي 2 من كتبه اللي هي تصور صور موجودة في مجموعة الكتب اللي عندي. اللي بحب أقوله إنه في الفترة السابقة ل 1880 أو 1890 ما كانش ممكن طباعة الصور بصورة ميكانيكية. الآن الصورة اللي بنشوفها كلها مطبوعة ميكانيكيا، يعني في ماكينة بتحط الصورة بتطلع لك طبعة ميكانيكية. يعني في الماضي كان لازم تطبع الصورة نفسها البومين برنت، يعني الصورة الأصلية وتلزقها في الكتاب عشان توثق الموضوع. I'm saying that prior to 1880 you have had to reproduce albumin prints individually and include them to the books. And that's why the books at that time were extremely valuable. And I'm very much interested in these books which has got original albumin prints glued into them. And I try to collect them at any price because of their valuable historic value. After 1880, in the United States in 1882, as a matter of fact, mechanical reproduction of photograph was invented. And of course, the value of albumin prints decreased in value as a means of conveying photographs, لكن their historic value still exists. فالحقيقة التصوير الميكانيكي، الطبع الميكانيكي للصور اخترع في أمريكا سنة 1882. وبعدها هذه الألبومين برنس الصور الأصلية اللي myself and Dr. Malikian has presented, يعني I don't say decreasing value, they are appreciating in value, but they didn't become the means of multiple reproduction of photographs. Mechanical printing took over and still there. فهذا من الصور تبعت فرانسيس بيدفورد is some of the most valuable albumin prints that are available and included in books. And as I've said, there are 3 of them. الحقيقة هذه stereoscopic بيسموها. Unfortunately, the reproduction here is not as good as the original. This is Damascus steel. And the stereoscopic photograph was an invention in the end of the 19th century. The photographer used to take 2 photographs. What he sees in one eye and what he sees in the other eye, and then there is a viewer, and when you look on them, you get a 3-dimensional photograph. This was الموضة كان that was the fashion in the end of the 19th century and early 20th century is to take these stereoscopic views, and the most important producer of them was the American Underwood. وهذه المجموعة مشهورة تبعت Underwood في عمل stereoscopic views، الصور التي تعطيك 3 dimensions، لكن برضه هذا بعد 1920 توقف، لكن المجموعات هذه متوفرة للمهتمين. Dr. Malikian talked about color photography, and this is Yokohama. شارع الآلام، طريق الآلام. والحقيقة ما قصدي شيء، لكن طريق الآلام كلها كانت هذه أوقاف إسلامية، وهبها السلطان للكنائس عشان يبنوا فيها كنائس، لكن أصليا كل هذا الشارع كله أوقاف إسلامية كان. في سنة 1890 this is photography is a German company which were the originators of color photography in Zurich, and they have had very excellent color photography of the world, starting from 1890. And I have got it also in my collection, many of their colored photographs, including an album in Hollywood covers. This is one of their productions. This is another هذا الحقيقة على مدخل الحرم من باب السمسمة بنسميه. هذه الفانتين موجودة حتى اليوم، والحقيقة هذه صورة فوتوغرافية باي فرانسيس اف ام جود، فرانسيس جود. هذا أيضا منظر للأقصى والحرم الشريف من كيشنر. كيشنر بالطبع هو لورد كيشنر، وانشهر عندنا كحاكم الخرطوم، حاكم السودان. لورد كيشنر كان حاكم السودان وبعدين صار وزير للحرب في الحكومة البريطانية في الحرب الأولى، وهو اللي بيتابع الصور في صور مشهورة يعني defend your country كان يقول البريطانيين اللي تطوعوا. لكن في سنة 1870 in my 1870s he was living in Jerusalem and he made many beautiful photographs, original photographs of Jerusalem. There are two sets of photographs which I have got done by Kitchener. He was working for the Palestine Exploration Fund, BF, and this is one of them. I would like to talk a little bit about the Palestine Exploration Fund اللي هو صندوق نسميها الاكسبلوريشن، التوثيق الفلسطيني او البحث الفلسطيني. هذا أسس في 1864 في بريطانيا، وكان أغراضه أول ما ألف أغراض بيبليكال توثيق التوراة، لكن بعد كم من سنة وجدوا إنه هذه يعني أسس التوراة أسس يعني الحقيقة ما قصد شيء، لكن قصص خيالية. فلذلك ركزوا على الواقع في فلسطين، اللي هو التاريخ الفعلي لفلسطين، الأماكن المقدسة لفلسطين، الآثار بتاع فلسطين، وبالتالي كانت مساهمتهم من أهم المساهمات في توثيق فلسطين في تلك الفترة. وحتى اليوم حتى الآن موجود البالستين اكسبلوريشن فاند، لا يزال عاملا في لندن في مركز له. أنا عضو فيه تلك السنوات، والحقيقة في 15 جانوري العام القادم لي محاضرة في المتحف البريطاني حتكون عن تاريخ التصوير الفوتوغرافي في فلسطين بما في ذلك مساهمات البالستين اكسبلوريشن فاند. فهذه صور كيتشنر أنا عرضتها لأنها نادرة ما انتشرت كثير، لكن الحقيقة كان مساهمات رئيسية في فلسطين. البالستين اكسبلوريشن فاند عنده مسح لفلسطين سموه سيرفي اوف وسترن فلسطين، وفي وثقوا حوالي 800 صورة. من أهم صور واحد اسمه ماكدونالد، هنري ماكدونالد. الحقيقة هذه الصور نادرة جدا، ولما صار تصدر في جدار الشرقي للسور القدس قبل 4-5 سنين أو قبل 5-6 سنين أو 7-8 سنين، الحقيقة الحكومة الأردنية بالطبع أشرفت على تصليح هذا الجدار، وأحضروا صور ماكدونالد كمرجع لكيفية إصلاح الجدار. يعني أخذوا الصور واستعملوها لإصلاح الجدار، فكان لها قيمة كبيرة. فأهم صور للبالستين اكسبلوريشن فاند demoted one of the photographers of the DF were McDonald and also Phillips. And I've got in my collection a very large collection of Phillips photographs. وهم وثقوا كل الأماكن التاريخية في فلسطين، لأنه الحقيقة بدوا زي ما قلت في biblical views، ووجدوا إنه ما في شيء على الأرض كلها عربي، فلذلك ركزوا على الآثار الموجودة في المنطقة. هذه الأوليف وود باندي of the 19th century. فالحقيقة هذا هو الكفر، وتفتحوا فيه الصور الفوتوغرافية تكون موجودة. وهذا زي ما قلت مرهون وميو كانوا هم أشهر الناس في بيعها في القدس العربية في بلاد الخليج، واستمروا حتى قبل 20 سنة. الآن ننتقل إلى بونفيس وسركيسيان توك about بونفيس. بونفيس was the most prolific photographer of the world. يعني أكثر واحد صور الأراضي المقدسة والقدس الخاصة هو بونفيس، لأنه كانوا عائلة الأب والزوجة والابن، وكانوا لهم هم بدوا في بيروت، لكن بعدين انتقل تجارتهم إلى القدس، وصار القدس مركز نشاطهم في التصوير، وأيضا إلى حد أقل سوريا ولبنان ومصر، لكن التركيز كان على فلسطين، وأخرجوا ألوف، يمكن 3000 4000 صورة لفلسطين. عندي في مجموعة على الأقل 1000 صورة أصلية للبونفيس منهم هذه الصور. وهذا الحقيقة سلوان، منطقة سلوان الآن بالطبع أكيد كانت قبل 130 120 سنة، والآن كلها بنيت وتغيرت معالمها كلية، والحقيقة فيها علينا معركة سياسية بينها وبين المستوطنين اللي يسموها ديفيد سيتي، مدينة داوود، تحولوها إلى مدينة توراتية، وبالطبع هي زي ما احنا شايفين كلنا هي مدينة عربية أصلية 100%. الحقيقة هذه برضو الجسمانية، والجسمانية ظهرت في كثير من الصور الفوتوغرافية، لأن الحقيقة فيها أشجار الزيتون اللي عمرها آلاف السنين، فهذه هي منظر الجسمانية لبروفيس في 1870. هذا الحقيقة دكتور ماليكيان presented some of the cards which the photographer used to publicize their work, and this is the one which used by the American colony. والحقيقة أنا like Mr. Dr. Malikian, I'm very much interested in this presentation because they document history. الحقيقة اللي حبيت أقوله أنا بس إنه بين كل هالصور الألوف الأمريكان كولوني وغيرها لما بدهم يبرزوا القدس ويسووها قبة الصخرة هي المعلم الرئيسي في المدينة. كيف في باريس المعلم الرئيسي هو برج إيفل، في روما الفاتيكان، في القدس المعلم الرئيسي هو قبة الصخرة. فلذلك أي دعاية، أي تصوير، أي مرجع لمدينة القدس ستجد المركز هو قبة الصخرة. كان في الماضي ولا يزال الآن. الآن أي صورة تطلع عليها في القدس إذا الشارع كان قبة الصخرة موجودة معنا في صورة القدس، مش موجودة قبة الصخرة مش القدس. فيعني أصبحت قبة الصخرة هي المرجع الرئيسي لجميع التصوير الفوتوغرافي في القدس خاصة. أتصور هذا الحقيقة نهاية الكلام تبعي، يعني أنه الحقيقة دكتور ماليكيان لكن I wanted to be sure. وإذا في يعني في تبادل الرأي، تبادل الأفكار، بالطبع نشوف الدكتور ماليكيان المعزل would be very pleased to respond. إذا في حدا له ملاحظات له أي، لكن برضه تأكد حكت في سيرة كمان إنه كان في فهم خاطئ للفن الإسلامي. يعني كان كلنا زي ما حكى الدكتور ماليكيان، يعني you are not the first one to say that Muslims and Jews used not to represent a human figure because there's again their religious beliefs. Then this was proved by documenting that it's not true. And the most important is Qasr Amra. Qasr Amra is only 30 or 40 kilometers out of Amman. And in this Qasr Amra, you will see during the Umayyin, the Umayyin dynasty, and that was in the year probably 680, 690. The whole walls are by human figures, and the flowers and animals and all that. Unfortunately now it's deteriorated, but it was documented by very important archaeologist Alois Musen. Alois Musen made the most tremendous documentation of water in maps, in photography, in documenting Qasr. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا كثير دكتور هشام على المعلومات القيمة. أنا كثير مشيق إنه أتعامل معك.
أهلا وسهلا.
آخر شيء بشكركم جميعا لحضوركم، وبشكر دارت على استضافتها للمعرض والمحاضرة، وبشكر المؤسسة العربية للصورة كمان بمساعدتها
في سؤال يعني قبل
تفضل.
أنا كنت بتوقع أسمع يعني بعض الحديث عن التصوير في الأردن، التصوير، هل التصوير الفوتوغرافي في الأردن يتولى تصويرات في الأردن أو في عمان؟ في عمان أنا صراحة يعني جيت اليوم حتى معلومات عن هل التصوير الفوتوغرافي في الأردن في عمان. القضية الأرمنية الأرمن قال لي أنا حاولت يعني سنوات بس ما نجحتش إني أحكي مع حد من الكبار المصورين القدامى الأرمن.
نحن نجحنا
أما ثلاث الجواب عندكم.
اوكي
تفضل.
نحن نجحنا بس في عنا مشكلة الوقت. كان أول شيء أنا مش ساكن في الأردن حاليا، وجو كمان عايش بنيويورك. فنحن لما التقينا بأول السنة هاي التقينا مع مصورين أرمن وعملنا ليست بأسماء الأرمن ل4 أجيال. بس بعدنا بعملية البحث لأنه مش كثير في صعوبة كثير الحكي مع المصورين، لأنه كل واحد مثل كامش كأنه سر ومش راضي يعطي، عرفت؟ فشوي عم نحاول.
أستاذ وليد تحت الطابق الأرضي صور العمال.
هذا
تحت شفتها كلها.
صورت بعض الملاحظات.
بس يعني الحقيقة أول صور أعمال حدود معرفتي يعني أحداث على الموضوع جدا هو الأمريكان كولوني سنة 1910 صوروا عمان، وعندي مجموعة من صور عمان والفترة 1910. هذه في حدود معرفتي أول مرة بصير فيها تصوير فوتوغرافي دقيق لعمان، وأنا هديت طبعات منها لأمين العاصم ولغيره. هذه أول مرة يعني قبل المصورين الأرمن كان في الأمريكان كولوني صوروا، وبرضه صور سيناء، ولكن أهم صور لهم هو صورهم لعمان 1910 قبل الأمن.
أي مؤسسة؟
أمريكان كولوني، الكولونية الأمريكية في الخليج. نعم؟
أمريكان.
لا مش أمريكان، لا هذول الأمريكان كولوني.
اسم العربي دكتور.
نعم.
أمريكان كولوني. إلها اسم عربي قبل تأسيس أمريكا.
نعم.
الشيخ جراح.
الشيخ جراح.
سمعت دكتور يعني قبل شوية على التوراة يعني بعد شوية يعني لا في أكاذيب عادي.
الأمريكان لما اجوا هذول السويديين حولوها لاوتيل ومركز للتصوير وسموها امريكان كولوني، لانه هذا السياح اللي بيهتموا فيه ولا هو اصلا بيت حسين بتاعنا. فهم اول من صوروا عمان 1910.
هو المقصد الأخ جوزيف إنه إحنا قاعدين بعمان. يعني صار لك تقريبا سنة بعمان.
أستاذ هشام.
مش عمان معناته مدينة التعددية ما ينجاب سيرتها بربع ساعة.
يعني نحن المحاضرة هاي عن تاريخ التصوير المنطقة من 1800.
كان مصورين أرمن وهذا بصور اللي بالقدس
إذا بتعطينا أسئلة بنسجل
موجود
بس مش 1800.
في صور